Welcome, 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 everyone. Welcome to Crashes and Taxes. I am your host for this podcast, Rebecca Walser. So excited that you could join me, and we are on video as well. Thank you for all of you that reach out and let us know how you enjoy Crashes and Taxes. We really appreciate it. And for those of you that reach out and say, hey, why aren't you on every single week? Please understand, everybody, this is something I do for fun, because I enjoy all these economic topics, these mathematical, these topics, these legal topics. And I do have a full-time practice. I have a wealth management practice, a investment advisory, and a law firm. So I've got quite a bit on my plate, and I would love to do this every day with all of you. But this is a fun project for me to talk to you and about the topics that I really care about, and not so much a tool to, for business. For those of you that are Walser Wealth clients that do watch the podcast, thank you. I appreciate it. And don't take what's in the podcast as, oh my gosh, has something changed? We already are doing all of this and acting on all this information at my firm. We are already involved in dealing with all of that for you. But the information that is more for the general public that is not working with Walser Wealth and doesn't have a professional to let them know these things that are happening. And obviously I can't give out professional advice on a podcast that's public, because your advice needs to be tailored to you. So I did have a client basically say, you don't give out the solutions, but it's more so because I can't, because we aren't able to give public advice in this public kind of forum. So all that said, if you guys want me to come on more, I have to have more time in my life beyond all of the television appearances that I already do, all of the other things that I do, and running my businesses. I need more time, and I will be happy to come on more. So grow the podcast, share the podcast, like the podcast, subscribe to the podcast, give us, all of the high ratings on Spotify and Apple, and we will come back more and more and more. As far as this week goes and the updates, it's really, there's a lot of stuff that is really going on globally in the world that is of concern, of deep concern. And what I would say is most recently happening is what we're starting to see is sort of a bifurcation globally of the West, NATO, and the United States on the one side, and the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now Saudi Arabia, looking to align a little bit more the Chinese route. And that's of a concern to us, because that it's the United States in February of 1974, Henry Kissinger and the King of Saudi Arabia. It's that agreement that created the petrodollar. And that petrodollar system has been virtually unbroken. We've had some attempts to break it. And if you think of the attempts and you look at the attempts, you talk about Saddam Hussein talking about selling oil and the euro. And then, of course, we had the Iraq invasion. After 9/11, they tied it to Iraq. It was really interesting timing. And then if you look at Muammar Gaddafi, he had an African syndicate that was prepared to sell oil outside of the dollar. And obviously we know what happened to him. So with some exceptions, there's been others too. I won't mention Ecuador, all others this year even. But the bottom line is that anytime there's been a threat to the petrodollar since 1974, it has been effectively dealt with and contained. And because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the West's reaction, which was rational, which was, hey, no. And so economic sanctions proceeded, which is kind of standard operating protocol for the United States against any country that they're not. We have sanctions against Iran. We have sanctions against, we're obviously have tariffs against China. We have sanctions against a lot of countries. And so that's par for the course. So we sanctioned economically Russia, and that in turn pushed them out of the SWIFT international payment system, which is really a system of the West, but the whole world uses. And that has pushed Russia to really start to align very closely in a scary way with China. And it has also created, when Russia got cooked out of SWIFT, they basically said to Europe, and you understand that Europe is almost really close to almost 60%, over 55% dependent on Russian energy, both natural gas and oil. Different countries, different allocations, but heavily dependent on Europe. And you know that Europe is now saying they're going to sanction Russia, and Russia's saying, I'm not going to sell anything to you, and is turning off pipelines. I'm not going to sell anything to you outside of the ruble and or gold. So now we have all of the Russian sales that were sold in dollars previous to not being sold in dollars. And what has happened is China, India, the Middle East, and Europe are all realigning how they're getting their energy supply. We're starting to see a big camaraderie between China and Russia, which is unnerving. And we also know that India and Russia are also potentially looking at, these energy transactions. So the whole world, if you just look at the total population at just under 8 billion, and China with 1.4 billion and India with 1.3 billion, that's 2.7 billion right there of the 8 billion. So those two are almost half of the population of the whole earth. You add in Europe to that because they have been upside down with their energy policy. You add in the Middle East to that, and you realize, I've said to you before that Israel in March started replacing their US dollar reserves with Chinese yuan. So you have to start to ask yourself, is the entire Middle East being realigned? And I do discuss uncomfortable things on this podcast because this is a change year. Financially, macroeconomically speaking, globally. And that means that we can't just think it's status quo and everything is as normal. We should definitely take steps to address what we could possibly see coming, if we can possibly see it. So my show is more about giving you the data of what's happening globally and saying, is there something that we could do to help us not have to go through as much pain as we would otherwise go through if we don't realize what's really going on. So the update of the news, globally speaking, is that we're starting to see this alignment really being clear. Obviously, we know that the former Japanese prime minister was assassinated recently. That was problematic. We've had Boris Johnson obviously resign after 60 members of his party had resigned. We have multiple resignations being discussed globally. A lot of leaders seem to be leaving their posts. We don't need to be afraid of what's happening. We just need to acknowledge, and we need to see if it leads us to some kind of patterned conclusion of what is happening that we need to take into account and we need to think about. I will tell you that Holland is the second largest food exporter in the world, behind the United States, of the breadbasket. And their farmers have obviously gotten to kind of like the Canadian truckers, these Holland farmers, are protesting, and they're putting their tractors in every municipality, bus station, grocery stores, highways, because the ESG, or which stands for environmental, social, and governance policies that are being promulgated by the government in Holland on the Danish farmers, the Dutch farmers, is potentially going to make them lose 30% of their farms. And so you see now Italy and Germany, actually, ironically, rising up and following the footsteps, their farmers following the footsteps of Holland's farmers. And Germany had negative output and exports for the first time, I believe, in, I don't know the exact amount of years, so I don't want to quote it, but to have a negative export out of Germany for the first time. I mean, they are an export country, just like China. That is what they do. They export a bunch of great cars and a lot of other great things, and that's what they do. So that is I mean, just a lot going on. And, I don't want to be Debbie Downer on this podcast and come on here and tell you, oh gosh, this is all these terrible things, one thing after another. But if the world was ending tomorrow, I wouldn't waste my time doing it. And I wouldn't ask you to waste your time watching it. I would just say, go to the beach, make a picnic and call it a day. We're not at that point. So don't be like, oh gosh, it's another Megan. I'm just telling you, I'm just relaying the truth of what's going on globally out there in the world and how all of these things have an economic impact. And we just have to, we have to talk about these things and we have to address them and we have to not be afraid, but we have to let it empower us. Knowledge is only powerful when it's followed by action. Knowledge that you just take and you just sit down with and you just realize, okay, that does nothing, right? We have to actually find something out and say, oh, what can I do about it and how will it improve? And I would love to give a lot of solutions on this podcast, but I can't give solutions publicly out because everyone's situation is different. When they're going to be focused on, retiring and taking money out of a portfolio is different than someone who wants to save up a lot of money for someone's wedding, is different than someone who wants to live a big legacy to a charity and multiple trusts and foundations. I mean, it's just a completely different spectrum of the world. And there's no way for me to say, this is what we should all do right now. But what we should all do right now is recognize that 2022 is a change year. It is happening as we speak every single day. And the end of this year is going to look nothing like what it looks like right now, because these things are happening globally on a very rapid and fast pace. And, we just had recently the 4th of July, our birthday celebration for America, the birth of our independence from England. And I think maybe it's time for some more independence again. Do we have too much tax policy? If we can afford to send so much money to all these other countries, are we being taxed too much? How do we afford to have all this money to send to all these other countries when we don't even afford to take care of our own homeless population and population that's hungry here? I don't know. I worry about all these world problems, but mostly I'm concerned about the health and the safety of the United States dollar and how that will impact the United States with this situation. We really have 3 potential military conflicts that are potentially ready to pop onto the scene. We could obviously have the most clear one, which would be a military escalation of Russia versus NATO, which is a big problem because, Putin has already made statements stating that if America does certain things, he will take those actions as an act of war directly against Russia. And I don't know that he would be wrong in that sense. I mean, how long can we pretend like we're not actually fighting Russia by sending just all of our equipment and troops to the Ukraine? I don't understand that, or at least we send just the money. So obviously there's no troops that are actively engaged. I'm not saying that there are. I'm saying there have been troops that have been deployed on a pause, a peacekeeping pause. So Russia, Ukraine, obviously NATO, Russia, U.S., Russia, that could be a thing. Iran and Israel, clearly. And then we obviously have the information that's come out of China that it seems like they're readying a military force to potentially look at going into Taiwan. I mean, why do you think that they're directing these planes to fly in the no-fly zone over and over and over? So any kind of military escalation on top of what's already happened with Russia and the SWIFT system and Russia, China, and the BRICS nations is what is a really big problem. We need to try to maintain calm as much as possible, because any kind of military escalation breakout, unfortunately, will really bring a lot of economic consequences very, very quickly. So it's a difficult time that we're still going through. And if you do not have a professional advisor, you really need, a lot of people, rightfully so, self-managed since 2009. Really from 2009 to 2020, you could throw a pin at a dart and hit a winner, because we had so much stimulus coming in, and we had true, actual GDP growth as well, with all kinds of, that's where all the social media companies IPO'd. They were started maybe earlier, but they IPO'd like 2004 to 2008, 2012. So they started earlier, but then they IPO'd IPO'd in that time frame. So you have all of the major social media companies IPO in that time frame. So we definitely had that. We definitely had biopharma. We definitely had a lot of things that did bring up the GDP of the market these last 12 years. But for the most part, we also never ended our QE, quantitative easing stimulus Federal Reserve policy. And we just printed so much money in the last 12 years. And you can see the M1 money supply is really stable from the 60s all the way through 2008. And in 2008 to 2020, it starts on this slow trajectory up. So we started getting used to kind of MMT and quantitative easing. And then when coronavirus happened in 2020, we just went full force MMT. And just, I think we increased the money supply, the M1 money supply in the United States by $5 trillion in 7 months. In 7 months, we increased the M1 money supply by $5 trillion. You have to understand the level of mathematical experiment that was. We had never done anything even close to that, never done anything even close to that in the history of recorded time. So the United States basically created and or authorized 10 trillion, and the rest of the world did 20 trillion. So that's $30 trillion globally that has been promulgated since 2020. It's unfathomable. And this is why we have super high inflation. And when you add in food and energy, and you don't look at just core CPI, but you add in food and energy, you've got double-digit inflation. So these are trying times that require really somebody who looks at the global factors, understands and sees what's coming, knows where we could potentially just even protect ourselves or just keep away from the losses. So I would encourage you, since I cannot give solutions and advice on a public forum, to definitely go and talk to a professional, because these are not the times to not know that you're in the right place and that you have a plan for what's happening. And other than that, don't worry. Everything will get through. This too shall pass. We shall get through this time. We will end the year at some point. It will be over, and we will move forward as a nation and as a world. And so it is not all negative. The economic numbers are negative. We had a little bit of positive employment news, but not enough to highlight, to bring up to, oh my gosh, we're at the beginning of a new phase of going back to normal. I wish we were there, but just not yet. So take care, everybody. I hope you have a great week. Again, share the podcast, like the podcast, subscribe to the podcast, let your friends know. If we get more people watching on a consistent basis, which we have a lot, I'm just saying, if I can take more of my time away to spend more time with you guys, I'd love to do it. But I do have to, run my companies. So I hope you all are doing great. Have a great week, everybody.